Okay, guys, welcome to Conspirinormal. This is going to be kind of a different show than we've been doing over the last, I would say, few months. We've been talking about our usual stuff, which is UFOs and ghosts and Bigfoot and cryptids and all kinds of stuff. But I am a big fan of, as some of you guys may know, of history podcasts. It's like probably my other favorite type of podcast, other than what the kind of podcast that we do. And have been lucky enough to get this gentleman on that has a history podcast out there. It's listed as Russian Rulers History Podcast, but it's also Russian History Retold. And I thought that with everything that's kind of going on in the news and the Ukraine war, that we could talk about what is happening and how it may fit into a broader historical context. So welcome, Mark Schauss. Welcome back to the program. This is I think the third time that you've been on. So
yeah,
congratulations.
I'm looking forward to it. It's always been fun.
Yeah. I always enjoy having you on. I always enjoy your insights. You know, we had you on back, I think like 2017 or 2018. And then we had you on a couple of years ago. And this is probably around the time that the Ukraine war just started, although you could say it started in 2014, but we may get to that. But so now there's been a lot of developments, and that's kind of the reason why I wanted to get you on with the limited permission of using Western arms inside Russia, which is not the occupied territories in Ukraine, but, you know, Russia proper, which I thought was pretty fraught there for a little bit, although it kind of seems to have died down now, although now today, like we're recording this on June 18th, Putin went to go see Kim Jong-un. So who knows what's going to happen there. But there's been a lot of like declarations, a lot of things back and forth. We just had the Ukraine peace summit that happened over the last weekend. And then Putin giving out his terms for a peace. And they couldn't have been more opposite from each other. The Ukrainians want the Russians to pull out completely. Putin wants the Ukrainians to pull out of any of the territory of those four provinces or oblasts that they've occupied. So there's been a lot going on, and I thought we would talk about some of this. And I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts, kind of starting out on this, like as you've been observing, and also kind of like from your own personal background and your now 14 years, congratulations, of doing your podcast on Russian history. So I feel like you've got some insight into this, and you've studied this a lot now.
Boy, I tell you, this war surprised me. I did not think that Putin was going to pull the trigger on this, because it was a no-win situation from the very beginning. There are reasons why he went into the Donbass region and those areas. One of the things is economics. Russia has more resources, physical resources in the ground than any country on the earth.
Yeah.
But the problem is that they're way out there. So getting them from Siberia and some of those regions and bringing it into where it can be refined and worked on and used is a great transportation issue. Not so in Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine, the Donbass region is extremely mineral rich. It is a resource wealthy area, and he had to take that because Russia as an economy under Putin is completely failed. This is an economy that just doesn't work. The only thing that he needs is oil prices to be extremely high, because that funds their country. Without that, they can't survive. So COVID really hit them hard. I mean, their economy was slaughtered under COVID because oil prices went down to zero.
Yeah.
Sub-zero.
Right.
So they were losing money hand over fist. They didn't know how to deal with this. So they needed some excuses to go there. And, his comment of, well, Russia invented Ukraine. Ukraine didn't exist before Russia. That's utter nonsense. Kyiv is the site that Russia started, and that was in Ukraine. It wasn't in Moscow. Moscow was this little bunch of little huts near a river, when Kyiv was one of the most vibrant cities in the world. It rivaled Paris and London back in the 900s to the 1000, 11th century. I mean, this was a vibrant area. It
Yeah, I
wasn't
guess
until the
until the
Mongols.
Mongols, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, when they invaded, they just wiped it all out. And Kiev didn't recover its population when they invaded in the 1240s until about the 1800s. And there was, well over 1,000 years of damage to that area. And the other one is that Putin is a Soviet citizen, not a Russian. He's really a Soviet. He wants to bring back that empire that he remembers when he was a KGB lieutenant back before 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. He really wants to bring that together. And if he can defeat Ukraine, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, they're all on his sights. And he wants that. He wants to bring back that old time religion, as you might say, of the Soviet era. That's one of his major goals. It seems a little far fetched because then you're starting to attack NATO. And this is why there's a certain candidate running for president of the United States who wants to disband NATO. And he would want that. I mean, that is one of his goals. He wants to be able to take those other regions that he had before, incorporate them back into the Russian Empire. And be honest, it was there before. Finland was part of the Russian Empire. All these other countries
Right.
that then became the Soviet Empire. He wouldn't mind taking Poland as well. I mean, Catherine took Poland. Many of the Spurs took Poland in many different ways. So I think it's just part of his mindset to go after something as big as expanding the Russian Empire beyond just his borders, to go back to that old empire. And that appeals to his people, to many of them. Many of them it doesn't. I'm privy to some people who work for Putin that I can't name because they'd like
Sure.
to stay off the radar.
Sure.
But some were cabinet members of his that I've been in contact with because of my podcast. They've said, there's one in particular who you cannot have a conversation about Putin without curse words on his side.
Really?
There's one stream of Russian curse words, and I'm like, you got to slow down. I don't know all of these. Can I write them down? I'd like to remember some of these because my Russian is a little bit rudimentary. But yeah, this guy just, everything that Putin's done, he says this man's one of the richest men in the world because he's plundered money from the Russian people and put it through places like Cyprus for decades. And the oligarchs who've backed him. And then, I'd not like to be an oligarch who all of a sudden wavers because they seem to be falling out of windows. The defenestration, as they call it. They fall out of windows of hospitals with IV bags attached to them.
That's true.
And I mean, it's dozens of them. They've just disappeared. Other ones who've, killed their whole families by mistake and then killed themselves. You got to be a little careful around this guy and, backing him and not backing him. And, him going to North Korea was not surprising. I'm sure he's looking for military aid because with the latest sanctions that the U.S. has put on him, that has really shut down a lot of their flow of cash. And the one country that can seem to circumvent that is North Korea. I'm sure he's looking for some ideas there.
Yeah, they already say that North Korea supplies a good percentage of the munitions that he's using in the war right now.
I mean, he's got
North
a limited
Korea,
supply.
yeah, North Korea could get food and trade and maybe even some missile technology from him as well. What would you say though? I mean, you mentioned the Soviet aspect of it, and I guess that is true that he kind of wants to put that back together. But is there more? It seems like there is more of a reach back to the idea of an old Russian empire. Like he sees himself as like Peter the Great or Catherine the Great. And I recently was watching a series of videos about some of this from a Russian man that I guess that he grew up in the Soviet Union but now lives in the UK. And he says that the czar that Putin really identifies with is Alexander the Third, who, after Alexander the Second is assassinated, which is kind of more of a liberal force, he comes in and reestablishes this really just draconian police state. And there seems to be like this idea of the resurgence of like a whole of like the Holy Mother Russia idea, than this nationalism. Or do you think that that's more pragmatic than it is he actually believes it?
I think it's a little bit of both with him. Alexander really, he revived the Okhrana, which was the secret police, the older version of the KGB and of his FSB. I would even go further back to who I think he really admires the most, and that's Ivan the Terrible. The whole term of the terrible is a misrepresentation of what Ivan Grozny means. It means awesome. It's not perfectly translatable into English, but it's more of Ivan the Awesome. This person who, could lead Mother Russia against all the infidels and all these people who have been subjugating them for all this time. And, one of the things when you mentioned that they were using missiles and weapons to go into Russia itself, Russia is a very paranoid country about invasions and, attacks from the outside. Everybody remembers Napoleon, Hitler, the Mongols, but then there's Charles the 12th of Sweden who attacked, and heading up and injured during the Battle of Poltava. They might have been able to defeat Peter the Great. And there was another battle that Peter almost lost. He was completely surrounded by the Ottoman Empire in a battle and could have been wiped out, and Russia would not exist the way it is today, except they threw away some bribes and were able to get out of that. But I think that Putin is looking back more towards the Ivan the Terrible time. And Alexander, of course, was this reactionary after the supposed liberalism of Alexander II. This liberalism was more of he freed the serfs, slaves of Russia. He had to. I mean, Catherine wanted to. Peter wanted to. They knew that it was an economic system that was bankrupting the people who held these slaves. They couldn't economically support this anymore, and it was keeping Russia backwards. So Alexander II just had the guts to say, okay, we're going to do this. But in actuality, it wasn't just, oh, you're all free now. No, they had to pay their way out. And if they were state serf, they were okay. They got to go out. And I'm going to be doing a series on the serfs of that time. And it's about a biography of one of the serfs himself who wrote, what his life was like under serfdom and what it was like after the freedom of Alexander II. And it wasn't, like, oh my gosh, you're now free. Go do what you want to do. It was a real rough life afterwards. And Alexander, though, was so upset with the assassination of his father that he really brought back this, conservatism, which was really built up by Nicholas I, who really, autocracy and, orthodoxy and, just bringing back that Romanovs own your country. And you're not Russians, you're Russians under the Romanovs. And I think Putin wants it to be Russia under Putin as long as he can live. He wants to be a Romanov. He wants to have that same authority and that same respect from his people that the Romanovs supposedly had. And that's why he knows that he's got to be careful because Nicholas II, he was overthrown and murdered.
Sure.
And he's not going to take that chance in the future.
Would you say a lot of what we're essentially talking about is that Putin and others see Russian identity as inherently imperialistic? Like that it's always been that pre-Soviet times, that the Soviet Union in a way was just an extension of that. And now there's a struggle to reestablish that again and, reclaim this identity.
Oh, absolutely. We look back at what Russia started under the Varangians, the supposed idea that they invited these Vikings to become their rulers to bestow order on their country, that there was no order within Russia, the people of the Rus, and that all of that when the Varangians came into this autocratic control of the land, that's when peace and good times came. And then you have all these things about orthodoxy becoming the controlling religion of Russia, and that Kiev became the next Rome, and especially Moscow after Constantinople fell. There was Rome, Constantinople, and then Moscow. Those were the three, and that this is the new Rome, and this is this autocracy that made the people more peaceful and saved them and protected them from all these invasions from all over the place. The invasions from the Ottomans up north into Russia was an extremely devastating thing to the Russian people. I mean, they would come in, they would steal millions of people over the centuries and send them down to the slave markets in Constantinople, in Kherson, and other Ottoman-controlled areas. I mean, when I was doing my 3-part series on the Great Game, that was part of why Russia wanted to expand it to places like Turkmenistan. Right. And that is because they wanted to free the people that were there. One of the envoys who went there saw over 3,000 people in this small city that were Russian slaves, and they were begging him, please free us. We're miserable. We're treated horribly, treated as bad as any slave in the United States was in the 1800s. So, they're looking at it this way. There's an
alternative to empire and expansion can be construed as an existential threat, because if you're not expanding, creating buffer zones, then you are being threatened and possibly invaded from outside, like has historically happened. That shaped their geopolitical consciousness.
Absolutely. It's the whole idea about being anti-immigrant, anybody coming from outside. This is what's happening in Europe right now. The far right is gaining so much ground because, oh my gosh, these immigrants are coming into our country and they're destroying our civilization. Putin is using this in Russia, saying, we can't have this. Problem he's having is a lot of the young people are leaving Russia. The intellectuals, the computer scientists, and all these people are going, we can't live in a society like this. We're paranoid all the time, and they're moving to other countries. They're certainly not coming to the United States. They're going to other European countries, Asian countries, where they feel like they have a little bit more freedom. And it's an interesting trend where people are moving from one, political spectrum to the other. And how it plays out, we don't know, because I again say I didn't think that Putin was going to invade Ukraine the way he did and take over those areas. But then when I started looking at the economics behind it, it made all the sense in the world. And I'm in the health field, and I do a lot of consulting for supplement companies. There's a number of products that are essential oils, fatty acids that people take as supplements that come from sunflower. Well, the largest producer of sunflower oil in the world is Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And now it's causing major disruptions in supply lines because of this. And so, we're looking at the economics. They were a huge supplier of grains to the world. It was one of the bread baskets of the world, rivaling Canada and the United States. And I think that Putin's trying to disrupt that economic area of theirs. I don't see a successful outcome of this at this point. I know a person who was one of the he was the president of the first private bank in Russia. He was a childhood friend of mine in New York. We used to ride bikes together, play tennis together, and all this. And he spoke fluent Russian, and he went out there, became it, and he had to have 4 bodyguards all the time around him when he would ever go outside. The only problem was he was about 6'10", and they all had to be taller than him. So we had pretty much a bunch of centers, a basketball team surrounding him at all times. And he said it was like the Wild Wild West after 1991. You know, it was just the mafia-like atmosphere. And now the mafia is the government in Russia. And you know, after some of my podcast episodes, I can honestly say I talked to my brother the other day, and he said, I don't think we're going to Russia or St. Petersburg anytime soon. I don't think it would be safe for us after looking at what happened with Alexei Navalny and with Brittany Griner. He said we'd probably be in the same position, so better not to visit the homeland anytime soon.
Right. There's that Wall Street Journal reporter that's being accused of spying there as well.
Mm-hmm.
We see, Mark, it's like the thing that worries me of this like escalating into like a bigger war is just that paranoia. And, you know, this was in some ways Putin's justification of invading and using this idea that NATO would take over, Ukraine would join NATO, and that there would be this like salient that was there, and that they'll be pointed right at him. And this idea that, you know, Russia would be hemmed in. And so when we start talking about, you know, basically sending weapons in, letting the Ukrainians hit with Western weapons, whatever the efficacy of that may be, it's a little worrisome because it makes it look like that this is exactly the history's repeating itself. You know, the Nazis and Napoleon, and, you know, and then you're adding some like France in, which is an interesting dynamic. But that paranoia is still there, and there is that real fear that like they could lash out. And the whole like red lines thing, at this point we've crossed so many of these, where's the last one? I think it's a real concern. The Western alliances and NATO need to be careful, and it seems like in some ways that they're just not being as careful as they probably should be.
Yeah, that's a big concern of mine. You know, it's that, what is that trigger point where they go enough is enough?
Yeah.
When do they put that, you know, Moscow line in World War II where they say, you're not going to cross this? You know, the Nazis, we're going to defend ourselves right here. This is it. You know, what is that point? It's not going to be within Russia. It's going to be somewhat outside.
Mm-hmm.
But are they crazy enough to go after NATO? You know, I think a lot of it is puffery by Putin. You know, bare his chest. He's this macho guy who, you know, wants to protect his little turf. And in some respects, it's just this, it's a mafioso type of thing. But when does he start putting out the hits? You know, when other people to try to, you know, I mean, he's already had hit squads after Zelensky. I mean, that we know of.
Yeah, right.
But where does he go beyond that? When does it become, you know, like Khashoggi from the Saudis? Where do those things start happening, where they start going after individuals? I mean, he's going after people like Brittany Griner and the Wall Street Journal reporter, you know, using them as bait and, you know, trying to make deals by incarcerating them. You know, what's his end game? I that's the thing that bothers me the most. What's his end game?
Mm-hmm.
You know, how far does he want to go with it where there's enough? You know, my thing with the Crimea was a bit different because Crimea really never was Ukrainian. It was from 1954 when Khrushchev gave them, you know, Ukraine, Crimea, and said, hey, thank you for being part of the Soviet Union. Here's a gift of some land. Crimea was a hard-fought piece of land. Goes back to the time with the Crimean Khanate, which is the breakup of the Golden Horde, the Mongols. And they were the ones who raided Russian territory the most and stole slaves and sold them, you know, in the markets in Constantinople and Istanbul. Then you have the Crimean War, where tens of thousands of Russians died fighting against the British, the Sardinians, and the French. So, you know, this is a Russian territory. They always felt that it was Russia. Ukraine's hold on it was always tenuous, and there were a lot more Russians there. So that one I wasn't completely despondent and angry about when they took Crimea. That was like, I can understand that.
Right.
When they went further and they went into Ukraine and then said, no, this is Russia. Ukraine was created by this. That was the big lie on Putin's part. And a lot of Russians bought it. But I think, his latest election, what do you get? 87% of the vote? Something like that?
Yeah.
That's about as fixed of an election as we can get. That's an election that was a fraud. There's no way, but
Right.
I would be frightened to vote against him. If I'm a Russian, because when Navalny died and the funeral was held, there were thousands of people that came out and they risked their lives, to honor this man who fought against Putin. But they saw what happened to Navalny. They saw you don't survive fighting this man. And it's a game that a lot of, there are a number of Russians who would be more than happy to vote Putin out, but they're scared to death. Mm-hmm. I don't think he's got a majority of the Russian people behind him at this point. It's just fear. And this is something that Ivan did, Alexander III did, Peter the Great. I'm starting in my podcast to use the word the great a lot less for these Russian rulers. Catherine, Peter, Vladimir, saying, that's a PR job for these people, because if you really look at all the things that he did, a lot of these were not the great things. Peter was a pretty cool ruler. St. Petersburg is basically built on the bones of tens of thousands of people who died while building his great city on a swamp in the north. And, Stalin did it. Lenin did it. I just did an episode on Lenin, of how he became the person that he became, that didn't care whether 1 million people died. To him, that was just a statistic. Although Stalin used that term, but to Lenin, it was like, I don't care if people die. It doesn't matter. And I think Putin's taking that mantelpiece of the ones who came before him, the Vladimir the Greats, the Ivan the Fourths, the Alexanders, and all those people. And he's just he likes the historical comparison to those people, and he considers himself Putin the Great.
Yeah, he considers himself a czar. He really does. As much as they would say that about, Stalin and call him the Red Czar and all these things, Putin really does look back to that as being like the czar. Let me say too, just as an aside about Ukraine and about, in some ways, like how complicated it is there, and in how many ways it's kind of like, I look at it as like a cousins war, and like they've always been fighting each other in a way, and the great Russians have always, lorded it over the little Russians, which is what they used to call the Ukrainians. If you look at old maps from like the early 20th or late 19th, early 20th century, it says Little Russia. It's interesting. And then White Russia. But it's always been that way. And you made the point about Crimea being mostly Russian. Well, in that eastern part of Ukraine, there are a lot of ethnic Russians for two reasons. You have where finally when Catherine takes over Crimea, they put Russian settlers in that area. And then in the Soviet times, there were plenty of Russian settlers there too. Like Khrushchev was born in Ukraine, but he was a Russian. So you have the people in the East identify more, like the eastern part of the Dnieper River, they identify more with, being Russian, and in like kind of a 50-50 split. So like, it's very complicated. It's not quite as, I think, as cut and dry as like, I think the Ukrainians would have it. And even before the Ukraine war started, like that's kind of something I knew, that like the eastern part of the country was much more towards Russia. The western part was in some ways was different than, like, Ukraine has two different kind of sections to it. And it seems like that's what he's trying to do, is just carve that off back for Russia.
Absolutely. Ukraine's history is so complex. The Cossacks were the basics. After the Mongols attacked, the Cossacks were basically the Ukrainians. and they were kind of the leaders of the Ukraine people. And they had their little splits. Like one time it was one of the hetmen, which is the head of the Cossacks, backed Charles XII against Peter the Great. And we had the battles there, and there was a lot of back and forth between backing the Russians, backing the Poles. They would go to whoever would give them the best deal, and it usually would become the Russians that would give them the best deal, and that's where their loyalties lied. Ukraine's if you look at the history of Ukraine, it goes a lot of back and forth between who they aligned themselves with. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't really until 1991 when they began to say, we want to become ourselves. We want to become a sovereign nation, one apart from Russia. And so did many of the other countries, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and all of these. Out of all of those countries, almost none of them are democratic. They were all autocratic, bringing back to the point that you made before. This was an autocracy thing. Do the Russian people really just want an autocracy? But you look at all the Soviet countries, and many of them that been controlled by the Russian Empire. Autocracy is what made them supposedly feel safer and under control. But what control is it? It's the control of the elite. The Soviet Union said, oh, we got rid of all the boyars and the elite people, which my family was part of. My family traces back into the Admiralty from Peter the Great when he started the Russian Navy.
Interesting.
My grandfather helped build the Alexander Bridge in Paris. Extremely wealthy. My mom, after the Russian Revolution, my grandfather was very smart. He knew it was coming. So he took all his money out of Russian banks and moved it to Yugoslavia to get it away from. He knew that somebody was going to take over, and it wasn't going to be good for the family. My mom, until she was about 15, didn't know what it was like to be without a maid. She never cooked. She never had to clean. She never had to do her laundry or anything like that. She was royalty. Then the Nazis came and took everything away, came over to this country. One of the people who sponsored my family to come to the United States was Igor Sikorsky of the helicopter fame. He was friends, his family was friends with my family from Russia. We also had part of the Ukraine family, Belozarsky had married one of the Cranes, which are the crane company of the United States. They sponsored my family to come over here. There was a lot of this group that had everything. And the communists got rid of, but they just replaced them with another set of elites. The Voroshilovs, all those top line Russians who just took over the dachas and the homes of the Russian elite, the Stroganovs and people like that, and they just replaced them with a bunch of pretty much uneducated communists who became the next elite, and Putin has made the oligarchs are the next elite. I mean, how the oligarchs actually came to being? When the Soviet Union dissolved, they had to take all these government-owned companies, and they wanted to give it to the people. So they gave them coupons saying you own or stock. And these companies say, hey, here's some coupons. You own, Gazprom, and you own these mining companies. People are like, hell, I can't buy bread with these frickin' coupons. Yep. I can't pay my rent with these. So what some people did, these oligarchs, they said, well, let's borrow some money and buy these shares at ridiculously low prices, and we'll own all these companies. So the people gave away, basically gave them for pennies.
Yeah.
Stock to all these companies. So they became, these small group of people became the next level of boyars and elites and that. It was just transferring this elitism of Russian history from one group to another over the years, and that's what the Russian people are left with. It's just a bunch of people who control everything, and that's their history since the 900s.
Some theorists would say, in addition to being inherently imperialistic, they are also inherently anti-democratic, and that goes for the whole double-headed eagle idea of Russia having this Eastern and versus Western crisis, and the Eastern one would be the stereotypically now politically incorrect idea of Oriental despotism, and some people would say that characterizes them, and that is what we are continuing to see, kind of like what you're talking about. Do you think that there was any kind of conscious failure on the West during that period that we really could have helped them adopt free markets in a sensible way? And was there any predatory behavior, do you think, on the part of Westerners at all, or was it a purely homegrown thing that created that new system of oligarchy?
It was an abandonment of the Russians. It was an absolute abandonment. 1991, we abandoned the Russians. We said, oh, you got to be democratic. You got to go into capitalism. You got to do it, but we're not going to help you.
Did any Westerners profit off of that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we stole off of that, and we took as much as we could, and that made Putin very angry. Mm-hmm. I mean, after Yeltsin was overthrown, and pretty much, I mean, Yeltsin didn't say, "Oh, I'm going to just give this to Putin because he's a really nice guy." I mean, this was underhanded. Yeltsin was sold. You get out, or you're going to be put out. You have no choice. And the Americans, the British, the French, most of the West just went, good luck, Russia. You do it on your own. We did it on our own. We didn't have any help. You don't need any help. You can do it on your own. And that, I think there was a betrayal. Mm-hmm. It was an immense betrayal by the West. Bill Clinton betrayed Russia. Bush betrayed Russia. Everybody betrayed that country. They had an opportunity to say, let's give them aid. They gave aid to Poland. No problem. Helped Lithuania, helped Latvia, helped Estonia, helped all the Eastern Bloc countries, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, pick up the help East Germany. No problem. But Russia, hey, we're pissed off at you for what you did. So we're just not going to help you anymore. And it was one of the greatest diplomatic, economic mistakes in world history.
100%
Absolutely. Agree. We abandoned the Russians, and we created this situation that's there now, a total lack of trust.
Yeah. I mean, it's very much like the Treaty of Versailles and the punitive, reparations that we inflicted on Germany, and how that gave rise to how it was all propped up, and how the Great Depression, once that happened, it gave rise to Hitler. It's it's the same way in the short-sightedness. But I think the interesting thing, though, about the rise of Putin is he doesn't really start out this way. Like, he tries to make these real overtures to the West. Mm-hmm. And like his first two terms that he was in office, that's kind of how it was. Like, there was really no true animosity towards him. But then, they start to see the encroachment of NATO, and that old kind of paranoia kind of comes in.
Who was the first leader of the world to ask the United States after 2001, September 11th? Who was the first person, the first leader to say, can we help you? It was Putin.
Yeah. We really had that in common at the time. They were dealing with Chechnya and Islamic terrorism as well.
Yeah, I did a two-part series on Russian conflicts after 1991. They had a lot of them. I mean, wow, they were dealing with a lot of issues. So, now we're paying the price for, just how much you say dissing him, mm-hmm. Dissing the Russians.
That's a good point, though, because the conflicts that they're dealing with separatism and things in what are the officially recognized boundaries. So even within those, there were separatists fighting to carve out their own countries. So even in the current Russian borders, that can be thought of as semi-imperial. And that's how it was gained in the past, that entire territory. So it's not like, oh, this is just, one people unto themselves here. They used to expand, now they're back. It's still, even within that, there is different nations.
Yeah, the Chuvash, the Ingwash, within Georgia, and the predecessor to the invasion of Ukraine is the Georgian conflicts, where the Ingwash and the Chuvash and all the different type of people wanted to have their autonomy, and Russia would go and go, okay, yeah, we'll help you out because maybe we can gain back Georgia, we can gain back those different lands that we had in the past. So, there's I feel kind of naive that I didn't think that Ukraine invasion would happen. Because if I had actually looked back from 1991 to 2001, there was a lot of hints.
Yeah.
And then when we abandoned Russia, I should have known, hey, this is going to happen. And the encroachment of NATO, I think, is another reason why I'm really concerned. This is like Napoleon, Hitler, Mongols, Ottomans. This is all encroachment. This is the history. And they're going, this is happening again.
Mm-hmm.
When are they going to stop? And that's what he's telling your people. When is NATO going to stop? They got Sweden. They got, Finland. They're on our border now. Khrushchev, one of his concerns when he did the Cuban Missile Crisis was because of all the missiles in Turkey. Right. And the deal that was not told to the American people for a long time. One of the reasons the Russians said, okay, we'll take the missiles out of Cuba is because Kennedy says, okay, we'll take the missiles out of Turkey that are on your doorstep. Even though those missiles in Turkey were old and they probably didn't work very well, but it was that perceived concern of an invasion, of a missile attack on the Russian soil. And so now for us to do that again, and then lo and behold, a Russian submarine shows up off the shores of Cuba last week.
Yep.
Huh. How surprising is that? Not at all. The Americans are all up in arms, they're freaking out. I'm like, what did you expect? We did this. It's not an administration. It's not a Republican or a Democratic administration that's doing this. I think we underestimate the effect of encroachment on Russia.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think it's a dangerous game. Basically, you're poking the bear. I mean, that's really what you're doing. And it's not understanding history, and it's not giving any kind of lip service and saying, okay, we understand. Like, it almost feels like you have to say, we understand, that this is how you feel, but that's never been said. I'm not sure if you're familiar with John Mearsheimer. He's a foreign policy guy, and he talks a lot about this subject and about why, Russia did what it did, and partly what it did. I don't think it's the whole reason, but the NATO reason is, I think, at least 50% of it.
Absolutely.
And he, talks about this idea that the West believes itself, and rightly so, to be a 21st century power, but there are still powers like Russia, China is another one, that believe they're in the 19th century and are playing the realpolitik game, which I think is basically what we're eventually going to have to play with these powers anyway if we don't want to have World War III. But this is what he's saying, and like you're dealing with a country in the 21st century that has a 19th century mentality and that sees the world in that way. And so the two don't match. And so we have all these ideas about international law and all these things, and these are all right things to have. But it's just like, when Ukraine talks about, or Zelensky talks about, Russia can have peace if they pull out. Well, guess what? That's not going to happen. And so it's like, you can't deal with pie in the sky with these type of powers. And it's like, for some reason, it feels like the West, the collective West, or NATO, however you want to say it, does not seem to get this.
Yeah, it's, I think, unrealistic expectations on both sides.
Yeah.
The Russians think they're going to get Ukraine, and NATO thinks they're going to stop, completely and push them back. This is just unrealistic expectations on both sides. This is not going to happen the way they want it to happen. It's nice. This is, the way we think things are, this is going to end up really nice and everybody's going to be happy on both sides. I mean, conflicts like this never happen. And the Russians have had this issue. I mean, when, after Napoleon was defeated, Nicholas I thought, I will be the policeman of Europe and make sure that the autocracies of Europe are going to be protected. And Alexander was the second and third, thought the same way. Great Britain goes, well, screw you. You're a bunch of idiots. We're not going to deal with this. Crimean War came out of that. Conflicts come out of these unrealistic expectations of one country against the other and groups against each other.
I want to get into the Great Game a little bit because we've referenced it, and some of our audience may not be really familiar with exactly what we're talking about. Me and Adam have been talking about this a lot, and I've noticed, of course, on in the media, both U.S. and European, I've seen especially a lot of UK pundits and foreign policy experts who tend to be have a particular axe to grind in this, and it has reminded me so much of that history. So is there just a basic crash course in what we're talking about by the Great Game you could give our audience?
Yeah, I did a 3-part series on the Great Game, episodes 301 through 303, that talk about this dynamics between Great Britain and Russia after the Napoleonic Wars. During the Napoleonic Wars, Russia, signed the Treaty of Tilsit, where they said, we're going to ban any work with Great Britain, economics. But then they kept on trading with it, and Napoleon got increasingly pissed off about it, which led to the invasion of Russia. And then, Russia and Great Britain fought together. They defeated Napoleon and pushed him all the way back to France, and then defeated him again at Waterloo, and all this other stuff. And then it was like, wait a minute, we're concerned about Russia expanding as they're doing. And they were going east and south. And what they were doing is getting closer and closer to India. And to Great Britain, that was their prime jewel, was India. And they kept on thinking there was these conspiracy ideas that were proposed by, British reactionaries, liberals, and back and forth as to what Russia's motives were, that they were going to go over into Afghanistan and then invade India from there, which never really was the plan of the Russians. There's no evidence they ever wanted to do anything but get into Afghanistan and stop British expansion, but also to have a buffer state in there. Afghanistan is one of these things that when the Russians invaded Afghanistan in the 80s, I just was like, why would you do this? Alexander the Great couldn't take this country.
Graveyard of empires, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, nobody could take this rocky, mountainous region with fanatics who would die for anything for their ground and their people. The Great Game was this battle basically over this area of Afghanistan and the gateway into India, and the fighting that went on and the thousands of people that lost their lives, and just the misunderstanding between the two countries. Part of the problem was, they'd send emissaries. And by the time the emissaries went from St. Petersburg to London, things had totally changed in, Turkmenistan or wherever they were fighting these wars. And it was a thing that lasted about 80, 90 years, this Great Game between these two empires that were expanding and taking over lands in India and Pakistan. It was now Pakistan. And, these other regions of Muslim-controlled countries. So it is a fascinating period of time between the two. And I see so many corollaries to what's going on today. Mm-hmm. Ukraine and how, the concerns of the West versus the concerns of Russia, and nobody really understanding each one of the countries and what their goals and plans are.
Yeah, I remember probably like mid to late part of the first decade of the 2000s, you started seeing political commentary referring to, is this the new great game, as U.S. and Russian relations started to deteriorate during that time. And yeah, it's a lot of very, very, very similar dynamics going on.
What I think the only possible outcome is if both leaders of both countries say, let's sit and talk. Let's get this over with. There was no other way. We need another what time? Reagan and Gorbachev.
Mm-hmm.
We need another time with Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin talking with Jimmy Carter, saying, let's just sit down. Let's all shut up and let's break down this. Let's get rid of these egos. We need to do that. And I think that's a possibility. That finally both sides will go, we're not getting anywhere. We're not winning. Russia's right now economically just in real deep trouble.
Because what's the alternative?
What are we going to do? You're going to start a nuclear war? Sorry, Russia, you ain't winning this one.
I've heard people bank on when Putin goes away, but when you then talk about regime change, that just makes their sense of it as existential threat just that much more, because now it's not only do we want to encircle them, but now we want to enact regime change like we've done to all these other countries in this new century, and create a Western-oriented government, and that means the end of Russia as they conceive themselves now. So it is as existential threat as some of them see it.
Russia's not going to change. This is a 1,100-year journey of being autocratic. Let's not try to change their basic inner soul. Let's just be honest, and let's all sit down and say, let's talk. Stop this. It's not going to work the way it's going right now. Bombs are not going to help. Guns are not going to help. We've got to come up with a different way. And I do think that this coming election in the United States is where we're going to start seeing this. It's after this that something might happen. I don't foresee it during this year. They're looking, and anybody who thinks that Russia did not interfere with any of our elections is completely crazy. They have been involved in elections, the Soviet Union, since the time of Lenin through Putin. They've been involved in elections all over the world, as we have.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So we can't be naive to think, they didn't try to change the election and try to go in somebody's favor. No, this is what they do. They've done it in Africa, Asia, and Europe. All over the world. It's naive to think that they haven't been doing this for their own self-interest. So we'll see what comes out of this. But I think next year is when we might see, I don't know which side, but there will be something that'll happen.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on who becomes elected, something is going to change, and a resolution will come.
Well, I look at it, and it's so ironic that it's not even funny. Trump might be the one, just because he loves Putin that much, that he might be the one that's to actually sit down and actually talk. And he'd probably get the Nobel Peace Prize. And of course, his ego would love that. But it almost seems like that's where we're going, because it seems that with Biden, he's just not going to.
Yeah, but I think part of it is that Putin thinks that Trump can become president again, and he's betting on that, and that will give him Ukraine.
Yeah.
To be very honest, Trump will give Putin Ukraine. There's almost no question about that.
Right.
And that's what he's banking on. But to be honest, from what I'm hearing from, I don't want to call them insiders, but people who have different points of view, they're saying he's banking on both sides. And he's thinking that, regardless of who becomes president next, a deal has to be made, because his people are tired of not having shampoo. They're tired of, I mean, when I start talking to Russian people that I, underground things, they're not getting shampoos, perfumes, combs, the little necessities, the things that they started getting used to from the West.
Yeah.
It's drying up, and they are not happy about this. They are concerned that how much longer do we have to be deprived of simple, basic things that our Western friends are having? And that's why so many hundreds of thousands of Russian young people left the country. They were escaping the southern borders, and they had to try to seal it up because it was kind of like when the Berlin Wall fell down. This is what happened in Russia in the past few years.
They didn't want to get conscripted too.
Yeah, I mean, they're emptying prisons to put them on the front line, and they're giving them kind of like bayonets against artillery as they did in World War One. And Putin's got to say, this can't keep on going because there's going to be a limit. And
the Western populations also, is becoming increasingly unpopular with them. So it's not going to be tenable for any political side to keep
how many more billions can we send to Ukraine? I mean, it's part of the inflationary pressures. I have a doctorate in business, and I look at this and go, we're looking at inflation. I look at the causes, and people are like, oh, freaking out about, Biden's policies and all this. I'm like, this is a global issue. Matter of fact, the U.S. is actually doing better than most countries when it comes to controlling inflation. But how much money can we keep on sending to this conflict where global grain prices are elevated because one of the major producers of grain for this world is Ukraine? How much longer can the oil prices are up because, well, aside from corporate greed, and we could go to a whole other episode on that. But how much of that is because of, the Russian flow? And, there's a lot of these issues that people are not seeing with this conflict, and it has to come to an end. Russia can't economically last more than a couple of years. It was a great book that I had that was published in 1989. It was about the coming economic crisis in the Soviet Union, where they actually looked, it was kind of like forensic accounting, looking at where the Soviet Union was at and saying they can't survive. In 1976, my Russian history professor, Dr. Paul Avrich, said the Soviet Union doesn't have 25 years to exist. And we're like just laughing in the classroom going, you gotta be kidding me. They're a superpower. This is economically, they can't survive. And he was working in the war games room back in the 1960s. And he was privy to a lot of information. He said, economically, they cannot survive. It is, house of cards that has no strong basis on the bottom. And there's earthquakes happening. So they're going to collapse. This is the same with Russia right now. How much longer can they survive? So I think there has to be some sort of once this election is done, I predict that whoever is elected president of the United States, talks will begin right away. And
even if it's Biden?
Yeah, absolutely. Either way, it doesn't matter because it's in Russia's best interest. Right now, they want one person to win. That's Trump.
Yeah.
To them, that would be the best outcome. But in the overall picture is what is, after that's over, whoever is the leader of the United States, we got to make a deal because they can't continue on anymore. That will end it.
What is their relationship with China? Because you did an episode on this, and historically, I've seen some articles where it talks about how Russia is almost like a vassal state now of China. And that China, has been said to have been kind of more like this moderating force, and India to a certain extent too. Both those countries have kept Putin like hemmed in so he's not doing anything like completely crazy, like set off a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, I think that both of them are going, let's be a little careful here. China's got their crisis economic problems. I mean, their real estate issues and their economy is on a really tight rope right now that it can collapse very easily. They don't want Russia to do anything stupid because that would disrupt global economic trade, which they can't afford to do. India is
Yeah.
in a very similar situation economically. You know, they're now the largest country in the world. I mean, population wise,
Yeah.
they've got
As
to
of
be
last
careful.
year.
And
Yeah.
look what happened with the election with Modi. I mean, he lost a lot of percentage of his supporters have, dropped off. So they've got to be a little, both countries are like, okay, Russia, we'll help you, but let's be a little careful here. So I think they're somewhat supportive, but they're also somewhat, concerned that any disruption in the world right now, and that's probably what's holding back any major acceleration to a conflict in the world, is those two economies are going, if it gets worse, if NATO gets involved, this is not good for either one of us, and we won't be involved in it. India and China will not get involved, and Russia's on their own. And I think they're probably saying that to him, but also, making sure that he doesn't look weak. Because if he looks weak, then the United States looks stronger, and that's not good for either India or China, especially China. So they're all playing this great game of the 21st century. Now It's not Great Britain and Russia. It's, the West, NATO, it's Russia, it's China, and India now. And then there's everybody else, looking around. I mean, Africa's right now, Russia's making great inroads into Africa.
Yeah, they are.
With their minerals and their resources. And, they're trying to play a game down there. So Africa's now in the loop of this great game. It's a global great game. So we're going from the 100 Years' War, the 7 Years' War, going into World War I, World War II, and now the great game of the whole world is going on, and it's not a military battle so much as it is an economic battle. Because the only way this world keeps on surviving is that the economies keep on growing. That's the thing, and there has to be a time when it stops. People are only happy with their countries when the economies improve. And, we're looking at the U.S. elections. Economies have improved for some people, most people. Some people feel like they've been left out. We look at Russia. The people don't look like they're happy with their economy. China's having severe problems. India's having a lot of problems. There comes a limit as to the growth, and I think that's part of the great game right now. Who can get that economic, benefit? You look at the UK, the current prime minister. His poll numbers are about as bad as you can get, and he's probably going to be ousted, because of the economic games that are being played there. Leaving Brexit and things like that. And how they're dealing with this, and how much more can they supply Ukraine in this fight with Russia? Russia's counting on it ending. Well, that $400 billion loan doesn't look like that's going to end, Ukraine support anytime soon. So Russia's got to look at this and go, damn, they haven't abandoned Ukraine yet. How much more, pain can we inflict on the Western economies? Is it going to make any difference anymore? So I'm I like to put this pessimistically optimistic that something is going to break.
Right. I mean, that's been the fear all along, that he could use a nuclear weapon or that he could attack NATO. I feel like he's not really in a position to attack NATO because he has 500,000 something troops in Ukraine, and they're kind of busy.
I don't think he's got military capability to attack NATO.
Yeah.
It would be suicide.
Yeah. But the Europeans are really scared right now.
Yeah. I mean, I'm European. I'm the first American born. I'm an immigrant.
Yeah.
My family is, and I have a lot of connections into Europe. And when we have these Rotary exchange students staying with us, they're concerned. They go, would you back? Their first question is, do you like Trump? It's always the first question that these overseas exchange students coming, these 15 to 18-year-olds who stay with us. The second one is, would you back us if Russia invaded? And they're really scared. I mean, these are young people who are frightened. And we have, some of them have, we knew them from 10, 12 years ago, and they still tell us to this day, are you still willing to back us? Are you still willing to protect us in case Russia invaded? They're scared in their 30s. We met them in their teens. Now we know them in their 30s, and they're scared. And, there is a fear in Europe. There's an optimism also that they're saying, I don't think that this is going to happen because it would be suicide for Russia. They don't have the kind of missile capacity. I always go back to this one story. When I was working in a camera shop in New York City as a salesperson, one of the guys who worked in the warehouse was a former Soviet pilot who had flown one of the MiGs into Finland to escape from the Soviet Union. And he said one of the fears that he had was when he would go out on flights, they had windshield washers for their windows when they would get, as they were flying around, and they would have isopropyl alcohol in their windshield wiper fluid. And he said quite often the mechanics would steal the isopropyl alcohol to drink and replace it with water. So the windshields would ice up so they couldn't see out of their windshield. He says, I was getting scared to be able to fly. And he said, we had so many mechanical problems, in the late part of the Soviet Union in the 80s and 70s. He goes, I was scared to fly anymore. That's why I defected to the West. Not because I had any ideological issues with the Soviet Union, but I was just scared to fly. Because, planes were falling apart in midair and things like that. And that is a fear that the military has today. They are having weapons that are actually not working. So for them to think that they're going to launch an attack against the West, who keeps up with their military, well, unless Boeing makes, the parts of the military. Aside from that, I think our parts are a hell of a lot more reliable than their parts are. And they have a fear of that. And that's why he keeps on sacking every general, keeps on rising up in the ranks, and all of a sudden that person disappears and they retire, disappear, or they get into a plane crash or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all very, the corruption is endemic there. And I've heard people say just stuff like, oh, whether nuclear missiles don't work. And I'm really just like, well, I don't know if I really want to test that, that whole thing. But on the obverse of this, with the war, with Russia-Ukrainian war, is there a possibility that the Ukrainians could collapse? Because the Russian manpower, the Russian population is way more than the Ukrainian population. And we could move all these, weapons in, but it's not going to do much good if there's no troops to use them.
And that is the greatest concern right now, is that now the Ukrainian men are saying, who are they going to start conscripting? The 65-year-old? They're going lower, higher in age.
Yeah.
When does that end? When do they lose resources? And that's what the Russians are hoping for. But the Russians are having that problem too. They're losing a greater proportion of their fighting men. And there's one group in Russia that you don't want to piss off, and that's the Russian women. The old babushkas. You don't want to piss them off and get them. They will sacrifice their lives in protest. You get to a point where they've had enough. They're done. That was part of what happened in St. Petersburg in 1917. It was not the Bolsheviks who started this revolution. It wasn't, these revolutionaries and all. It was the women of St. Petersburg that brought down the Russian Romanov regime. It was their protest that stopped it and said, we've had enough. We're not getting fed. Our men are dying. We're done. It is the Russian women. You get to a point where they say, that's it. We're finished. And I think that that's true of very many societies out there, especially patriarchal societies where men control things, and you get to a point where the women go, I've had enough. I've had enough of my sons dying. I've had enough of, eating a slice of bread a day to survive. That's it. And that's what brought down the czars in Russia, was the protests of the women during those early days in February and March of 1917 that caused Nicholas II to brought down the czar.
I have heard, and this is something that I also saw from that same YouTuber that I was watching several of his videos, that they have actually not really been recruiting from St. Petersburg and Moscow. That it's all these other towns, and especially in like some of these more, these autonomous republics.
Yeah, because they are nervous, but that's going to end. I mean, as vast as Russia is, there's a limit. They have a limit because they're throwing men as fodder as they did in World War I, where millions of Russians were dying. They were told to pick up weapons of the guys who died in front of them in order to fight, because they didn't have enough rifles and artillery to fight. So
they were doing that in Stalingrad too. Like that was
that was my longest episode I've ever done in my podcast in 14 years. The Battle of Stalingrad. That was almost an hour. It was like, this is, what an epic thing that these men were doing whatever they could to fight off that last little, they had, what was it? 97% of Stalingrad was in the German hands at one point. And that last little 3% just expanded out.
Yeah.
I don't know which side is going to cry uncle first. I don't think either side is ever going to do it. The one thing that they have to keep in Ukraine is Zelensky alive. I don't know if there's anybody with that kind of charisma. He's kind of like the Ukrainian Stalin in the charisma field, not in the autocracy part, but in his charisma.
Well, they are kind of under a war government that isn't exactly democratic right now. Also, to be fair, he is kind of playing that role.
Yeah, they do have one person. I think it's what's the boxer's name? He was the mayor of Kyiv. His brother was a world heavyweight champion, and so was his brother. So they've got a couple people out there who can step up after a while. But yeah, Zelensky is just keeping it together as that figurehead. That the rest of the world, he can raise money. He's kind of like one of those venture capitalists who goes, let's go out there, we can raise some more money and get, some more to keep us going in a losing battle at this point.
I've seen that Russian reality that you just outlined, used as justification for continuing hostilities and continuing to push. Well, they're not going to be able to last. So if we just keep on until they're, totally bled out, we can somehow win this conflict for Ukraine. Like, do you think that the other side to that is that it's just as dire for the Ukrainians? So peace is really the best option.
Absolutely. At this point, there is no winner. There can be no winner in this conflict. This is a no-sum game at this point. There is no 1 + 1 = 2 anymore. This is take what you got. I know Zelensky doesn't want to give up any Ukrainian territory. Putin doesn't want to give any of the territory he's gained. There's got to be a compromise in there. There is no other way out. It's suicidal to go any further at this point. Nobody's going to gain any more advantage anymore. They're both bleeding out.
Yeah. And if you see just like, it was very much in like that in 2022, it was kind of a war of movement, first on the Russian side, and then the Ukrainians took back a lot of their territory. After that, it's like World War I. And it's still like World War I, even with the Russians even kind of pushing forward. I mean, if you look at the map of what they're gaining, I mean, it's just like a village here or there. I mean, they're fighting for, sending just masses of guys getting killed, and just, it's like the Battle of the Somme or Verdun. I mean, it's literally that bad. And I've heard a lot of people speculate that the way this thing may not necessarily end, but be like a frozen conflict, almost like, North to South Korea, that it's just going to be this line of control or this demilitarized zone. And that might be all that you can really hope for.
And at this point, that might be the best option, having a DMZ where nobody can cross, aside from the North Koreans now throwing garbage balloons at the South. But
right.
This is like basically giving your Monty Python, insults from the castle in French. I mean, it's like, what else are you going to do at this point? I think a DMZ might be one of the best thoughts. Is like, just put this line down here. You don't cross. You don't cross. Let's end this and let's get back to normal trade, and I think the Chinese and the Indian governments would be most happy about that.
Right. And I think that this peace conference that Zelensky put together, I mean, it's like a lot of people in the global South, or like China, India, did not sign on to it. But I think that they see that just like that Ukraine's goals are unrealistic, and that basically, Saudi Arabia said there's no negotiation unless Russia isn't at the table.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like that almost seems like that's, at least for like what they say is the global South and these countries, that may be really what is going to turn the tide. And all Trump may be able to do if he gets in is just deny funding the Ukrainians, which he has said that he's going to do.
But they have enough funding for quite a number of years with this new deal, with this $400 billion loan that was approved. That pretty much takes that out of the equation.
Yeah. We just may not be involved anymore.
Right. And, that would be the Russians' greatest hope. That's why they will be involved in our election. They will interfere with it. They've already started. I mean,
right.
I'm on TikTok. I see it.
Everybody has, and this is a game the CIA has played from our side against them in Africa and Asia and all over the world. So
absolutely,
we're all doing it, and it's just we're the target now.
One final question for you, Mark, before I let you go. You said something very interesting. You were talking to one of your guests, one of your more recent interviews that you did, one of these authors, and you said that because you were putting out the book, the 2-part book called Understanding Putin, and now you're looking at maybe saying that it's more like understanding Russia as a whole. And it was interesting because also, the Gogol's Troika, his poem, and that you guys mentioned that, and I just recently had just heard about that, and you guys mentioned that in one of those episodes. I can't remember which the person you were talking to, but that poem in a way really kind of helps understand, Russia and its history, and even what's going on now.
Oh boy, I got this inroad with Cornell University Press. They had a whole bunch of different authors that came at me with their different ideas of what was going on with Russia and how it affected them. But the one was interesting about their culture. The culture, their literature, their music, and everything, how it affected their psyche of their country. In Gogol's poems and in all their writings, the literature, and how that really molded the way the people think about their country. In America, we think of ourselves as being very nationalistic. I don't think we hold a candle to the way the Russians feel about their country. And I think it's all the invasions and the threats to them that have galvanized them as a people. And, they're so much more multinational as Russians than any other country on earth. There's Muslims, there's groups from different peoples, the Tatars, the Chuvash, the Ingra, so many of them who maybe not wanting to split off, for their own groups, but they're part Russians and they have so many nationalities over the years. The Russian Empire, as long as you said you were Russian, they tolerated you. They didn't care your color, your looks, anything, to an extent. As long as you said you were Russian, they were okay with that. And the people, felt this, loyalty to a country like that. And I think that has changed. This is part of their psyche that we don't understand in the West or in the East. The Japanese are Japanese. Americans, we're a lot of immigrants, but we wanted you to become American. But the Russians were like, we don't care what religion you were, to an extent, unless you were Jewish. But as long as you were Russians, we accepted you into our family. As long as you fought for us, you fought in our wars, we, battled for our greater being, that was okay. This is something that's so unique, and as we've talked about, it's what we don't understand about the Russian people. We look at Putin, we look at, his group as these white Russians, but we don't understand it's a far greater group than that. And I think it's something that this one author was bringing out, that the literature and the writing and these poems and, the Chekhovs, the Tolstoys and all this had a different feeling of the Russian heart and soul. And so until we can understand that, I don't think we're going to ever become allies between the West and Russia. It's still that giant chasm of that Euro-Oriental country that is different than anything else in the world.
Well, I think that's very well said. And a good place to stop. I want to thank you, Mark, for coming on. This has been a great discussion. I think
It's been fun.
We could continue.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to talk about, but please tell people where they can find your podcast, and also have you put out the books? Or are you still working on those?
I'm still working. I'm looking at so many projects at the same time. It's kind of crazy.
That is.
I'm trying to keep up with the podcast. I put out a new episode every other week. It's the Russian Rulers History Podcast. It's also known as Russian History Retold. I'll try to rename it without losing people. But my latest episodes, this latest series, I think is going to be really interesting. Probably one of the most interesting women in world history. Her name is Princess Ekaterina Dashkova. And she was a friend of Catherine the Great's. She helped overthrow Catherine's husband, Peter III. Her father helped overthrow Ivan VI and to put her godmother, Elizabeth, her eventual godmother, Elizabeth, Empress Elizabeth, as the ruler of Russia. But this woman also was the head of the first woman to be ever head of the Russian Scientific Society. She was also invited by Benjamin Franklin to be part of the American Scientific Society. She was a friend of Voltaire, Diderot, and people like that. When I found out about this woman, I was like, how did I not know this for 14 years about this amazing human being who, as one American put it, probably could have been the CEO of a major corporation at any time, run a government. She became a friend of Catherine's when she was 15 years old and Catherine was 30. She spoke 5 languages fluently, and her worst language was Russian. So that's when I think your listeners may be really interested. I am absolutely fascinated by this person. So that's
cool.
Got a lot of interesting episodes out there. You don't have to listen to all 304. I actually had a truck driver from Arkansas said he was traveling cross country listening to my podcast back and forth. And I said, "Oh dear God, my wife doesn't even want to hear my voice that often." So,
you got to get an award.
I really do enjoy it, and I come back to it. And like, also too, your episodes are short and digestible, and you do manage to pack a lot into at least a 20-minute episode. So
Do my best.
it was really
Thanks for having me on, both of you. This has been fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. Stay on the line for us. We're gonna close out, guys. I want to thank Mark for being a part of this tonight, and I will be actually Serviano about to hang out in real life.
Yeah.
For the
coming
first
out to
time in
C-Town.
a few months, but coming up in November, I got the Strange Realities Conference coming up November 1st, 2nd, and online on the 3rd. So guys, get your tickets for that, strangerealitiesconference.com. And also, if you want to support us on Patreon, that is available as well too, although we haven't, put a lot out there lately.
You can find that at patreon.com/Conspirinormal. That's the home of the hosted videos of the monthly Strange Reality streaming presentations as well. So if you sign up there at the $10 level, you'll get at least a conference worth of very well put together lectures from some of our favorite guests on there as well. And that's over at patreon.com/Conspirinormal.
Excellent. All right, guys. Thank you so much. We're going to take a little bit of a break, but we'll be back in July on Conspirinormal.